Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Catherine Atmansky, and I have the honor and the joy of serving as the director of the School of Leadership Studies at Royal Roads University. I'd like to invite you to let us know where you're joining from, where in the world you're joining from, and in particular, if you know the ancestral name of the lands from which you're joining, please feel free to offer that in the chat. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining today and Royal Roads University is located on the ancestral lands of the Kosapsan and the Lekwungen ancestors and families. I'm so very grateful for their stewardship of these beautiful lands, especially as we're coming into spring now. When I go out for my morning walk, I'm starting to see the buds coming up. And as you can see in the forefront of this photo, a little bit of purple blurring. I'm sure that the camas flowers, the camas lilies will be in bloom very shortly. And so this land, these beautiful lands have been a gathering place for time immemorial. And we acknowledge that we continue to learn, even though we're joining from all around the world, we continue to create a gathering space and a space for learning as we enter into these webinars together. I'll pass it over to Wanda and I'll ask my friend Selena to click to the next slide, please. This webinar is hosted by the Masters of Arts in Global Leadership. And this is part of a series. We've been running a series of webinars ever since the pandemic hit, called Leading in Extraordinary Times. And now we have a very specific global focus that Wanda and Selena and Lisa Korak and many others have been working diligently to organize. And so today I'd like to pass it over to you, Wanda, to take us through the rest of today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Hello, everybody. My name is Wanda Krautz, and I'm program head of the Global Leadership program at Royal Roads University. And I'm also located here at the university itself on campus, and very grateful to be working on these lands as well, of the Kosapsan and Lekwungen families. So the webinar today, as Catherine mentioned, is part of a series of webinars. This is our 4th out of 5. Our last one is next month on March 15th, and that one will be about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why diversity is not enough. Today, we're talking about global leadership and internationalization. And Royal Roads has a strong orientation towards internationalization and embracing partnerships with international partners in different contexts. And so in today's webinar, we'll be talking with 3 of our alumni and student and talking about their experiences in internationalization in terms of leading out in those partnerships and collaborating both in country. So with the example of Ecuador, we have a course in the Global Leadership program among our suite of courses relating to internationalization, and of course in the context of global leadership. And this course is called International Cultural Leadership Field School. And so what that entails is a number of different learning directions in how to lean out and how to engage with others. Our partners in Ecuador and in India have hosted our students both in person, so in Ecuador, and on virtually, so not quite in person, but the experience I think we'll learn about feels very much to our students and feels very much to those who participated with us in these virtual studies, very much in person, in that we've brought people into leaning in with us on many of the global leadership and wicked problems that we have to grapple with, even when we couldn't go out and take part in person in these excursions. So our alumni help us understand the impact and fluidity of internationalization, where we're leaning out in those participations and also leaning in the growth and leadership that ensues from these partnerships. We have 3 participants with us today. Our first speaker is Mark Roosblom. He's the Director of Campus Planning and Facilities Management at the University of the Fraser Valley. Then we have with us speaking to internationalization, April Killens. April is the Executive Director of ABC Head Start Society in Edmonton. And we also have Susan Klein with us. And Susan has a communications consulting business in Edmonton. So I'd like to say welcome to our 3 speakers today, speaking to global leadership and internationalization as part of our webinar series From Local to Global Leadership. And next slide, Selena, please. Welcome, Mark.
Good morning, everyone. Finding the mute button. So yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Wanda, I want to acknowledge that I am presenting to you from Abbotsford. Abbotsford is located in the traditional territories of the Stolo people. They have been here for 10,000 years and call this land Softamuk. It is beautiful, and I enjoy the view of Colchan nearly every day as I drive to work. And Colchan is also known as Mount Baker. And so for this opportunity to be here with you today, I'm grateful and happy to be able to have 10 minutes. So if I move very fast through my presentation, feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them, I'm sure, later on. So leading in a changing world, and the world is changing very rapidly. These are just some captures from the Ecuador experience that we had during the Masters of Global Leadership, and what Wanda spoke to. It was a very impressive and very mind-changing experience. I think when we go to the next slide, you know, we have an opportunity to, and Selena, there you go. You know, we have an opportunity to see the world through a different lens. The world, and especially its young people, are much more global-minded and connected than ever before. The rise of mobile technologies, cell phones has brought knowledge to other places and activities and developments in the world, and brought people much closer together. And even those, I would say, at times much less fortunate. You know, YouTube and TikTok and a number of these global platforms have really brought the world out to anyone who has a mobile device. And we don't always recognize that impact, but it does have an impact because it causes people to think about you know, their future and what it means for them. And we look at the migration of people and how that is fueled for hopes for a better life away from where they originally had their home and their homeland. And it is currently estimated that there's about 25 million people that are refugees, climate refugees, just in the world alone right now, and 250 million people worldwide living outside of their country of origin, either by choice or otherwise. So the world population is no longer homogeneous, it's much more diverse. And one of the things that the UN Sustainability Development Goals do is they provide us a platform through which we can view the lens, through which we can view the world. And a lot of it provides us a guide for future considerations for ourselves as leaders and upcoming leaders, students, but also in everything we do on a daily basis. Yeah, we can go next slide. So when we look at it from a global leadership perspective, there's always lessons to be learned. And Ecuador and the Ecuadorian experience that we had was profound. It is a beautiful country, high up in the mountains. There's a picture of Quito, which is at 10,000 feet. So you have to make sure you prepare a bit for high altitude training. It's a country that has a very rich history, rich indigenous history, and a growing population. There's been decades of prosperity, especially with the GDP growth based on the oil industry. Ecuador has become, or was, one of the OPEC countries and a large oil exporter. But it also put a lot of pressure on industry and the oil field development. And there's lots of stories about how this industry and this GDP growth impacted Ecuadorians unequally throughout the country, and especially those in the Amazon that we'll touch on a little bit later. So go to the next slide. What's interesting to note is that as part of our visit to Ecuador, we spent some time with the Ecuadorian military, and it's really telling because they are seeking for so many of these questions. They're seeking answers to questions that, we often think about, well, it's a different country, there's a different context. But what we find actually is that that many of these questions align globally. There's not the struggles that we have about developing our economies, about growing our young people, about it touches all countries all across the world. And in some areas you'd find them much more because of immediate climate change, for example, where crops are being destroyed and floods are causing people to migrate. But in other countries like Ecuador, the indigenous context is one that seems in a lot of ways to have affinities with what we're seeing here in Canada. You can go to the next slide. So, the Ecuadorian indigenous peoples have long been recognized and have constitutional rights and privileges. They are celebrated and acknowledged as people who need to be consulted in the management of the land. Indigenous ways of knowing go back many centuries. The celebration of these peoples is celebrated in Ecuadorian roots. However, it's been a very difficult transition for indigenous people into a prosperous Ecuador, and still many are left behind. It brings up strife and hard feelings, especially if they are giving up homeland and ways of knowing to accommodate the larger economical growth and welfare, in which they often see little themselves. Indigenous people in rural Ecuador still often live below the poverty line. And it's interesting to compare that to the Canadian context, where we still also have Indigenous communities in Canada that do not have access to clean running water or even access to healthcare or education. We can flip to the next slide. These are some pictures of some of the wonderful people we've met on our travels in Ecuador. The lady on the left is from the highlands in Ecuador. The children are from an Amazon village that we visited and stayed with. It's called Suasa, and then the two young men are trainees of the military, and they come from villages close to the Ecuadorian rainforest, the Amazon there, and they are brought into the military to help the military understand indigenous ways of being, doing, and knowing, but also to help bridge. And it's a way of doing it. I'm not saying it's the right way of doing it, but it's been an approach that the Ecuadorian military have been looking to help bridge the relationship with traditional peoples in their traditional territory. We can go to the next slide. And there's a little picture of the village of Tsuata where we stayed and all the people there. And there's often times for quiet contemplation. So if we go to the next slide, just be mindful of my time. So when we look at the challenges and the opportunities that we have in our shared experience of the world around us, is diversity, equality, and addressing diversity, equality, and addressing inequalities will be a strong future driver for decision making. As I mentioned earlier, technology has brought a lot of young people together, and there's no more acceptance of these huge inequalities around the world. I think there's some statistics out there that there's 1% of the population owns 99% or 90% of the world's wealth, and that disparity is becoming more and more apparent and less acceptable. The climate and environmental considerations are going to drive many of our decisions going forward. As I mentioned earlier, we have 250 million people in the world already living outside of their original homeland or home, and a variety of these people are displaced because of climate impacts. And so we need to keep it to consideration the fact that as the world changes, due to climate change, we're going to see these impacts wherever we are in the world. The new generation of workers coming into the workplace, the millennials and Generation Z, also have a different mindset and a different way of thinking about work priorities, what it means for them. What we're seeing in the Northern Hemisphere is that there's actually in certain areas, North America and Europe, a decline in population. So there's a need to bring in young people, but they don't work and they don't think and they don't necessarily act in the same way as the baby boomers did. So how do we appropriately pave the way together to allow these folks to take on the world? Because we've always done it in a certain way, definitely a baby boomer attitude is one that will have to shift, and we have to shift quickly. The pandemic has shown us a way to do so, but there's much more in shifting that can be done over the years to come. We can go into the next slide. So empowerment of women. So under the UN SDG number 5, gender equality, breaking down the glass ceiling and ensuring that women are educated and their contribution to the country's economies increase and become at a higher, or at least equal level to those. It really increases the country's GDP. I think overall it is upwards of 10 to 40% of impact that it can have, depending on where a country is, when that equalization occurs and women are empowered and glass ceilings are removed, that GDP growth can be huge. So for a country like Ecuador, there's a huge opportunity there, and it all starts with education and the empowerment of the young. Next slide. Great picture. We visited a local market, and there were all stalls around. They were all run by women, and they were having so much fun and back and forth. It was just a great place. You wondered, oh, there's my timer. We sometimes wondered, if they were there for themselves, just enjoying themselves, or if it was for the sale of the pig's ears, which were quite nice actually. Okay, so I'm going to move quickly. I'm over time. We'll go to the next slide. This is important to recognize that the change of people over the years, although generational differences and in different cultural contexts, global trends are setting a tone to change around the globe, especially are setting a tone for change around the globe, especially with young people upcoming, as well as those historically oppressed. We need to consider the lens of intersectionality, recognize our own biases and be self-reflective, who we are, where do we come from, how will others perceive us, and what does it mean for future relationships. We also need to consider how the workplace needs to adapt to those that are thinking differently. And so we're living in a time of increasing diagnosis of awareness of neurodivergent conditions like autism and Tourette's, attention deficit disorders, and others. And people who are neurodiverse can, through their differences, be an extraordinary strength in the life living and in the workplace. So neurodivergent thinkers often possess extraordinary talents when it comes to innovation, creative storytelling, empathy, design concepts, alternate ways of thinking, and problem solving. So as we think about diversity and inclusion, we need to think very broadly and don't limit us to where we come from or what our backgrounds are. We can go into the next slide. So what being global minded might look like for you: a shared commitment to sustainable future, a shared commitment to diversity and equality, wealth, health, and knowledge sharing, equity, a commitment to a shared decision-making process, and considering the global changes affecting us all locally and beyond. And I referenced technology, but there's artificial intelligence and the climate change. We can go to the next slide. Just some great pictures of some wonderful people we met in Ecuador. Build trust, consider people first, always in the core of your decision making. Develop those strong partnerships locally and internationally, and think of them as long-lasting relationships that are going to be there for you, because it's not that big of a world. Recognize the people that came before us. The indigenous ways of thinking have been in place for a very long time and have served the country and the land and the environment well. And 200 years of colonial impacts, and it seems like we're destroying the world faster than we can rebuild it. So we have to acknowledge those that have come before us and the knowledge that came before us, and sharing of the wealth, knowledge, and the resources beyond that small percentage I mentioned earlier in the presentation. We can just go to the next slide. So the 70 UN SDGs we use as a hallmark tool, I guess, throughout the global leadership masters, and it really does provide us with a lot of ways to connect. There are so many alignments within those goals amongst countries, amongst people, that working through those on a continuous basis will really help us come together. There's all opportunities for within that to ensure that we are healthy, educated, and peaceful, that we have strong and stable economies, that we're social, political, and economically adaptable to a changing world, and we manage climate change, a threat for us all, and we create a future for the children of tomorrow. And I think with rushing through those last couple of slides, the last one is just a thank you. Elsewhere, and yeah, looking forward to next presenters. I'm sorry I took so much time.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Mark. A very powerful presentation on your experience. And I would just like to remind that we do have time at the very end for questions and answers. So please do hold on to your questions, and we'll circle back to the presenters. I'd like to bring April in and welcome April Killens. Ecuador to Edmonton, context is everything. Welcome, April.
Hi, hello, my name is April. I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional meeting grounds and home to many Indigenous nations, but specifically the ancestral and traditional territories of the Cree, the Dene, the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, the Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and the Métis Nation. I actually traveled to Ecuador with Mark and others from our Royal Roads cohort in 2019 in the MA Global Leadership Program. Mark just gave us an amazing broad lensed view of that trip and what we learned. So I'm going to speak more personally about my experience on that trip and some of the internal learnings that I had and how I've been able to pull that thread through into my personal leadership practice. There's so many examples that I could share with you about that and how my practice has grown and my mind has expanded because of this trip. But we only have 10 minutes together. So I've chosen to share a central learning that's really followed and kept coming back to me, is this idea that context is everything. And when I say that, I'm speaking specifically to cultural context and knowing the context of, I'm in human services, so the people that I'm working with, before I try to presume that I know the answer to how to help them. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. This trip brought us to 10 communities where we were immersed in the local context by visiting with residents, local interest groups, and even we got to bunk with a host family in an Indigenous community. Mark showed you those pictures from Zawada. It was really powerful. We also saw several examples of social innovation where different communities found innovative ways to create a local economy. So for example, the picture on this slide is from Las Salinas, where women were participating in a co-op that makes and sells woven fiber products like sweaters and ponchos. In addition, we saw various community development models that really expanded my understanding of asset-based community development and what it means to grow something from the ground up with the people in that place. Next slide. In Quito, I had the opportunity to present as a panelist at the War College. This being an audience where women are a relatively new addition to the military, I chose a topic about harnessing the capacity of women for peace building. And I spoke between two female members of the Ecuadorian military. I just have to say that this was so far outside my comfort zone. I put my name in for the opportunity because it scared me so much, and I definitely grew because I took the risk. Next slide. So I'm looking out at 300 men in uniform, and I'm about to tell them why they need leadership from women. And I was quaking. But at the end of my presentation, I was asked a question from a higher ranking officer. He stood at the mic and he asked me why women aren't as reliable as men. So I asked him to elaborate because I needed more information. And he said that they have many excuses to not show up for their duties. And as we unpacked that, most of the examples he gave me were about their children and how they always had to shirk their responsibilities to take care of their children. So I replied that I thought, you know, you should ask them what's getting in the way. What are the barriers? How can the organization support them to show up for the role as their male colleagues do? And I mentioned that it was hard for me to say more because I don't understand the context in which they live and work. But later, when we got back on the bus and we're in transit, I just realized, oh, I wish I had answered that question with a question. And that's the question on the next slide. What does childcare look like here? I had no idea, and it took me about an hour of processing to realize that this society might not recognize reliable childcare as the key to employment equity for men and women. Next slide. So in Edmonton, I work at a children's charity, and when I came home, I was the manager of community resilience, and my time in Ecuador gave me many new examples of what a resilient community could look like, but it especially hit home for me the role that my work plays in the larger ecosystem of a strong community. I'm now the executive director of that organization, and I'd like to take you back to Ecuador to share some examples of the ways I'm inviting cultural context in to be a central pillar in my organization. Next slide. So during my trip with Royal Roads, I stayed in a house with a host family in a small Indigenous community that was unserviced by government infrastructure. So they had no running water. The river nearby had a parasite warning. And it really struck me there how many things were just dirty. I noticed people in the same clothes day after day, remnants of a previous night's dinner left on a shirt, you know, no fresh water showers, no paper flushing down toilets. Of course, there was just a different comfort level with these things here because of what was available and what the norms were. In Canada, though, this level of sanitization could get you a call from Children's Services. And although there was a warning for the river, the children still swam in it. The playground equipment definitely wouldn't stand up to Canadian safety ratings. And these things also would turn heads, you know, about the way that you're raising your kids. So culturally, from what I could see, the children got up before daylight with their parents, and they had absolute freedom to run and play in the community until evening. Even with this busy road running through the community and several really big work trucks passing to local bridge construction. So this allowed parents to work the land, cultivating without a need to entertain their kids. But from what I could see, the kids were generally left to their own devices, and I didn't see any formal schooling, so I'm not sure how that was structured. I didn't ask, so I don't want to make assumptions about that, but I didn't see a schoolhouse or anything of that nature. Next slide. So being immersed in this culture, I knew that I was the outsider. So although, I noticed what seemed missing here, I came to it with an open mind, and I also noticed what was gained. These children were happy. They enjoyed the river. They had endless playmates. They were knowledgeable about the land. They helped guide us through the jungle. They were living in a very tight-knit community where meals were taken together. The whole community gathered often in ceremony. They knew about the history of their people. They were so proud of their connection to the local hieroglyphs that they showed us along the river. And they were growing up exposed to their traditional language and culture. So the communal aspect of growing up this way was attractive to me. And it was easy to see that standards of cleanliness and safety were really inconsequential to whether these kids would grow up with secure attachment to be mentally strong and contributing members of their society and their community. And I have no doubt that these kids have a same or better chance of growing up nurtured and loved as anyone in my community back home. Next slide. Michael Unger is the leading researcher on resilience theory in Canada, and he has a book called What Works about designing human service programs that support resilience for children, youth, and families. One of his 7 principles for resilience building programs is to be relevant to place and culture. We must be relevant to the family's cultural context. Next slide. Back in Canada, 80% of our programs at ABC, where I work, the 80% of our participants report a country of origin other than Canada. So it was hugely relevant that my experience with these children in Ecuador opened my mind to the value of affirming a family's approach to parenting. I was able to bring that focus on cultural context into both our family programming and our classrooms, and I'll share an example of each. So on the family side, the team of social workers that I was supervising when I got back began a course to help families navigate parenting in Canada when coming from a variety of worldviews. And we're lucky to have a very diverse staff too. So the people doing these presentations had lots of personal experience with the topic. We actually ended up remodeling our whole family program using Michael Unger's resiliency framework as a guide. And then on the classroom side, I sought out a research partnership with the Multilingual Families Lab. They're a lab at the local university. And we're now in our 3rd year of a research study that's led to core training and specialty teaching tools for staff to embed heritage languages in the classroom. Let's go to the next slide. So part of being relevant to place and culture in my home in Treaty 6 territory is also working in partnership with local Indigenous communities. And we're now in our 2nd year bringing Indigenous knowledge keepers into our classrooms. So they share teachings with the staff and children, and we have a smudge altar at every site. And our team has they've come so far in their fluidity for meeting families on their level. Next slide. So that's the end of my presentation. In closing, I just want to say that the trip to Ecuador was rewarding, fun, it was educational. Nelson Mandela said that education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a fire. And my experience in the MAGO program did both. It filled my mind with theory, it showed me what that looked like in practice, and then it empowered me to incorporate those learnings into my life and work. Thank you for spending some time with me today.
Thank you, April. What another powerful presentation, speaking more specifically to the personal as part of the political. So thank you so much. And we'll shift gears a little bit with inviting Susan Klein on reaching out or leaning out and also leaning back in with the example of India. Welcome.
Thank you, Wanda, for your earlier introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes, all good.
Great. And special hello to those who are joining from India and Germany and Hong Kong and across Canada. I'm here in Edmonton. It is part of Treaty 6 and the ancestral lands of the Cree and the Dene and the Nakota Sioux and Inuit and Métis. For me, the concept of inviting in and venturing out, to use that theme, reflects patterns found in really rich partnerships and immersive learning experiences. Some of my thinking around internationalization's fluidity and impact and how it can remain relevant today comes from the International Cultural Leadership Field Trip in the fall of 2021, which was partnership between Royal Roads and PRIA, the participatory research in Asia. I was one of 6 grad students who virtually connected to various community groups in India to listen and learn and share with each other and embrace PRIA's principles and their approach to democratizing knowledge and empowering people to make changes through participatory approaches and collectivism. We were introduced to some of PRIA's key partners, including the Martha Farrell Foundation, and I'm really grateful to them for all the learnings they imparted on us. If I could have the next slide, Selena, please. Internationalization, as I'm learning, is fraught with issues, and there's lots of scholars who critically address how advanced education can decolonize. One of my learnings is that even though the value of partnerships, cooperation, and mutual exchange may exist across international projects, as we've seen through example, there is much more to peeling back hundreds of years of colonialism. My recent learning experience with PRIA and the Martha Farrell Foundation showed me the power of direct collaboration of those most affected by issues, gendered issues, sexual violence. And PRIA's theory of change, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I know there's some PRIA people on the line, the theory of change to make people aware of their rights and responsibilities, in particular the poor and those considered marginalized, and also, just as importantly, to sensitize government agencies to the changes needed. So briefly, I'm going to cover some of the virtual connections made between Canada and India, and how these field trip exchanges produced feelings of solidarity around issues while recognizing sort of the ongoing effects of colonialism and systemic inequities. I'll touch on how we can practice self-reflexivity. And I think we heard that in April's talk as well as Mark, to address our strengths and our weaknesses, allowing us to see complexities and contexts not always recognized. And finally, my presentation calls on really all of us. Are there ways that we can mobilize and work together for a better world? The top right-hand corner of this particular screenshot is the women that we met. They're women domestic workers from Gurugram. And they're working as a collective to bring more dignity to their workplaces and an end to what is really a universal issue, which is sexual harassment and sexual violence in the workplace and in the public. So I'll go to the next slide, please. So over site visits of 7 weeks, they were powerful and enriching, at times heartbreaking, and they attested though to the strength of partnerships that are participatory in nature and respectful of how interdependent we all are just across the global communities. I think you heard that in Mark's talk and also in April's. As grad students, we learned from domestic workers who offer support to each other. And as they shared their experiences, we also shared the Canadian context of issues around sexual violence, the power dynamics of patriarchal societies. We met young women who are first-time local leaders who face extraordinary challenges when taking up governing seats, reserved seats for women. It's an innovative provision in India's constitution. And we talked with community leaders who are working in settlements and slums to get basic public services of water and sanitation to the people. And did we see affinities to Canada? Yes, of course, through all of those stories. We were introduced to the youth-led program KBC and the young people who worked together to collect data on the safety of women and girls, advocating for change with better lighting installed in certain public areas that deemed unsafe, and relocating a liquor shop to an area on the outskirts of a town. These were things that the women, by coming together, were actually able to achieve, and it really instilled confidence in them to do that work. We also learned about the community sports program being run by Priya, and the partnership with Pro Sport Development. And through the organization, Slum Soccer, we were shown how sport can be used for development and to support gender equality. Next slide, please. Not to overplay the positive, there are profound challenges, there are profound struggles, but every site visit brought to the fore a constructive kind of power of participatory approaches, that participatory approaches to change. There's something so compelling about that, and the critical importance of democracy for all and democracy for communities at the ground level, and knowledge for all at the ground level. The domestic workers, while still challenged in their lives, had come together to reclaim their feelings of self-worth, gathering strength through kinship with each other. And this didn't happen overnight, as the director of Martha Farrell Foundation told us, Nandita Bhatt. This, collectivism isn't magic, but the women, through art making and stitching their stories to a sari, were sharing painful private moments in their lives, private experiences of sexual harassment and sexual violence, opening up to each other. And they were learning about prevention, protection, and actions they could take. As we learned, they had presented the sari to New Delhi's Deputy Chief Minister, urging him to fix dysfunctional local committees that are in place to deal with harassment. And so this precipitated an action among the lagging committees. And I think something that the women were absolutely proud of for their advocacy. Next slide, please. My approach is to leaning into situations that are outside of my Western frames. April talked about sort of a discomfort at times, and I can only imagine, being in front of 300 military personnel. That might be a little hard, but there's this learning that has happened since I actually started my studies with Royal Roads. And it is around, how do I reflect on who I am? And how do I bring that to the world? And organizational experts Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer come to mind sometimes because they write a lot about self-awareness and how so much relies on surrendering control. Just think about that, surrendering control. We all have such difficulty with that. They called it resting our habitual thoughts. So in doing this, we create space, and I think many of you know this, space to be present in the receiving of others' experiences. And I felt this happened among our small Canadian cohort, and engagement seemed high among the Indian communities we visited. I can't speak for them, but through the exchanges, there was a breaking down of what I thought to be that well-entrenched Western model of we're here to help. and old global north stepping up for global south. An article I read recently by Sharon Stein moved me as I considered reflexivity. She wrote that we need to cultivate sensitivity to ongoing patterns of inequality that have become naturalized as habits. Summarizing what she said, this kind of work takes humility about what we don't know and self-reflexivity about what is complicity and what could be harm. This is a bit of wisdom I hold close. And as we invite in and venture out and look to tackle big world problems, it is so important that we have that kind of grounding. We need to constantly check in with ourselves. How are we seeing or perceiving and being? And how do we cause no harm with all our good intentions? In these, next slide, please, Selena, thank you. In these pandemic times, a field trip that would normally have had grad students on the ground in India was all done virtually. And honestly, as I watched Mark and April's presentations, I really had a pang of really missing actually that physical sense of having been there. But I can tell you that it was a rich, rich experience. The partners planning between PRIA and Royal Roads ensured that there were very few barriers to our interactions. In fact, there was levels of intimacy that spoke to where we were coming from, whether it was youth reading poetry to us from their home kitchen table, and we were joining them from our homes. There was that level of connection there that is hard to explain, but there it was. And, you know, very few barriers to our interactions. And so the usual suspects of technology issues, distance, language barriers, they didn't really interfere with the flow of our exchanges. By learning about PRIA's pioneering, community-based participatory approach, I was able to come to a clearer understanding of how knowledge has been commoditized. And that is something that PRIA's founder, Rashish Tandon, would say, you know, possessed by the fortunate and kept from those less so. In my thinking about the diversity of knowledge and knowledge systems, I've begun listening more closely, I would say, for differences and appreciating too the many, many commonalities that exist for we humans sharing this planet in these turbulent times. Thank you all. My references are attached to the presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Susan. This is beautiful. You've touched on so many really important points to consider, beginning with a question and also towards the end, also asking some really important questions for us to consider. I would like to, in the little time we have, open the floor to questions for any of the three or all presenters. You can choose the hands up sign under your reactions button. That's usually located at the bottom of your screen. And I'll also scan in the chat for any questions. We also have students within the MAGO program joining us on campus for the three of you who are presenting and others who are joining us from all over. So you can probably see the classroom in the screen at the top. If there's any questions from the classroom as well, we have a little bit of time, and here's your opportunity. All right. Perhaps, oh, Selena has raised her hand. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all of your presentations today. A question I had, perhaps more for the folks who completed the program in 2019, but Susan, relevant for you because you're really immersed in the program right now as well. How did the program help you understand how to navigate the challenges you learned about within the MAGO program during these complex times, during these COVID times? So April, you shared all the different ways you're able to implement new learning in your profession back at home. How are you able to keep that alive in these challenging times?
I mean, my work is continuing during the pandemic because childcare and like we're a Head Start agency, but we've been open throughout. And so I think I've been blessed with the opportunity to continue applying those things at work. But how do I keep that alive with even just everything that's going on right now? There's a lot of division. I don't know. That's been a sort of a theme in my life at the moment. I don't know if other people can relate. Just, you know, seeing a lot of division happening even out in the streets right now. And I saw a beautiful piece of public art yesterday that I drove by. They've painted the whole side of a building in Edmonton bright green, and they've put a neon sign on it that says, "Let's heal the divide." And I think seeing in Ecuador and having that experiential learning of how everyone's coming from a different experience and that shapes the way that they move in the world helps me remember that, like, just keep that in mind. Like, there's so much division, but not everybody knows the world the way I know the world. And so, yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's a bit of a tangent, but it's what came to me. So I'm going to pass it to Mark.
Thanks, April. I think this is my assumption that the MAGO program, I think, and learning and being more mindful about you know, how you're situated in the world, I think allows you to be considerate of all these other things that we might otherwise not have considered. You know, you build a curiosity, I guess, during your journey, your learning journey, and that curiosity helps you, you know, stop and reflect first before stepping into a conversation that might have been informed by biases that you didn't even know you had. And so, you know, the MAGO program is a learning journey. And I think one of the best things that I've learned from it is that you continue to learn after. It doesn't stop. It sets these things in motion in your brain and in your being and how you think about the world and how you reflect on the world that will continue shaping your work. And so, you know, for me here at the university, it makes me very mindful about work that we do around EDI. And although I'm responsible for the physical environment, you know, the physical environment is very influential on how students experience their time at school. So, you know, I'm now constantly asking more and more questions about what is their experience, what is influencing other people's experience, and how are we, through biases sometimes unknown to us, influencing how students are experiencing maybe their first time at school or their first, you know, in the classroom. So it will influence us all differently, but it is that growing curiosity that might help you see the world, as April said too, a little bit differently than you might have before.
Thank you both for your answers. I think we have just maybe 1 or 2 minutes left, and I see we've got one more question. Guy, if you wanted to share the question with us, please. We can't hear. We'll just give Guy maybe 5 more seconds. Oh, we can hear.
Hello, I'm Samuel, the former member of 2021, and thank you for the presentation. I would like to have a question for Susan. As you have tried review experience about the virtual field trip to the India. So I would like to know more about how technology makes you to connect and cooperate with other team members during this field trip, and any difficulties you face. Thank you.
So there's a bit of an echo in the classroom, but what I think I heard was the question, how do you connect and collaborate with team members of diversity in such situations? Is that correct? Yes, okay. No? How did you cooperate and communicate with others during the virtual field trip? Is that it? Yes, okay. All right, awesome.
Hi, Alec. It was more challenging, perhaps, but can you hear me okay? Yeah, the technology was our friend, really. It could have gone wrong, but it didn't, and it held us together as a group. I think there was some magic in the air between the cohort and the groups that we were meeting. I honestly, I don't know how else to put it. There was something that was very organic about what happened there. And I think Wanda and Catherine, you're on the line, and maybe you can attest to that. Every time we left our sessions, whether it be the field trip sessions or the debrief with Priya and Martha Farrell Foundation and the other partners, the amount of energy that was shared by the cohort here in Canada on different messenger tools and applications. We were so alive after being in those sessions. We felt a connection that was just so palpable and hard to describe, but it wasn't, there are certain things I would say that you get from physically being in a location and physically being in person with each other. And there is a richness there. But certainly if ever we transported to that kind of experience of physically being there, we all sensed it, we all felt it. The quality of the live streaming that we were experiencing, and the women singing to us at the end of one of the sessions, and women really listening to our stories as well. It was truly an exchange. And I don't think I've even half answered your question, Alec, but let me know if there's anything else you want me to say.
Thank you so much for that answer, Susan. Given that we are at or actually past time, I would just like to thank you so much to Susan, Mark, and April for your beautiful presentations and the time you've given us today. Really, really appreciate your knowledge and your sharing of your learning. This is extremely precious. And understandably, we're over time, so if anyone needs to drop off, you're welcome to. And I would like to then pass it on to Selena, if you could help us wrap up, please. Thank you.
Absolutely. And just to echo Wanda one more time, a big, big thank you to all of our presenters for sharing all of your knowledge and experience with us today, and for everyone who is joining us live and also for watching today's recording. If you have any questions about what we shared today, our MAGL program, or anything else that comes to mind around global leadership and internationalization, you can always send us a message, as the conversation will very much continue beyond our webinar today. Our webinar today, as mentioned, is just one wonderful session within a series we've been running here within the Global Leadership Programs at Royal Roads University. And on this slide, you can see some of the topics we've covered already. We'll be sure to share the recording links with you all if you're interested in joining in on those conversations. And we wanted to make sure you knew our upcoming date for our, as of right now, final episode in our From Local to Global Leadership webinar series. So on March 15th, we'll be engaging in a conversation around diversity is not enough. And we'll be sure to share that registration link in our follow-up communications as well. And within our follow-up communications, you'll also have some information around how you can continue to keep connecting with us. So if you have any questions about Royal Roads and our programs, we have our wonderful enrollment teams here on campus, eager to answer any questions you may have. And if you're hoping to connect with the School of Leadership directly, with Wanda or Catherine, Lisa Korak, you can connect with them at leadership.admin@royalroads.ca. So with that, we're going to wish all of you a wonderful rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where in the world you're joining us from today. Bye, everyone.